What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nerdy Professor podcast, where we talk about everything black, bold, and beautiful. I'm your host, the Nerdy Professor, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the evolution of the black church in Canada from slavery to the 1900s. Black churches emerged as a crucial institution for spiritual guidance, community building, and resistance against racial discrimination. Before we get into the history segment, I want to talk about Attack on Titan. So I've already discussed this anime in the previous season, so I'm just going to give you a highlight of the plot. Also, if you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's very good, but really dark. Attack on Titan is an anime that revolves around humanity's fight for survival against giant, monstrous creatures called Titans. The show follows Eren, Mikasa, and Armin as they fight for resistance and freedom against a seemingly unstoppable enemy. That's the spoiler-free version. Now go watch the show. So, what makes Attack on Titan resonate so deeply is how these characters' battles reflect a broader human condition, particularly when we think about marginalized groups throughout history. Take Eren, for example. His drive to break free from the walls symbolized the human yearning to break free from the chains of oppression, whether those chains are physical, societal, or mental. His relentless pursuit of freedom and identity mirrors the long, hard-fought struggles of black communities in Canada. Much like the residents in Attack on Titan, behind their walled cities, black people in Canada were once confined to segregated spaces, denied basic rights, and expected to live within the boundaries set by a system that saw them as other. And just like the characters in anime who fought not just Titans, but the overarching system that limits their very existence, black Canadians faced an unrelenting system of slavery, segregation, and exclusion. The very walls that protected them from the external threats also confined them, forcing them to carve out their own spaces of resistance and survival. This is where the black church in Canada becomes so important. In Attack on Titan, the walls are a means of survival, but they are also a symbol of limitation. For black communities in Canada, the black church served as a sanctuary, a place that provided protection, but also the opportunity to break down the barriers of societal injustice. Much like the Titans in the anime symbolize a force of destruction and domination, the systemic racism that black Canadians faced was a monstrous, ever-present force that threatened their very survival. The forces of systemic oppression, whether through slavery, exclusion from social and political spaces, or institutional racism, operated like these Titans, keeping communities under siege. But the black church, much like the walls in Attack on Titan, provided a buffer, a means of protection against those forces. It became a place where people could come together, a space that offered refuge from the outside world, and perhaps most importantly, a place where people could rise up against the injustices they faced. In a world where their very existence was questioned, the black church allowed black Canadians to not only survive, but thrive. It became a powerful institution that fostered a sense of community, unity, and shared purpose. It gave people the ability to reclaim their identity, just like Eren and his allies do in their pursuit of freedom. In the anime, the Titans are a clear representation of tyranny and oppression. In the real world, those Titans were embodied in slavery, systemic racism, and social exclusion. Just as the people of Attack on Titan used the walls to protect themselves and find the courage to rise up, the black church became the wall that protected black Canadians, providing them with the strength to rise against the societal forces threatening their existence. The walls didn't just hold them in place, they also kept the outside world at bay, long enough for them to reclaim their agency, their voice, and their freedom. And that's where the connection lies. The black church was both the sanctuary and the rallying point for resistance, a place of strength for those whose very survival was at stake. So when I was looking at Attack on Titan and the struggles of humanity inside the wall, I saw not just the battle for survival against Titans, but a story of reclaiming identity, fighting against destructive forces, and breaking free from confinement. This mirrors the resilience and courage of black communities in Canada, who used the black church to build strength, resist oppression, and fight for a place in a world that sought to keep them marginalized. The walls in Attack on Titan might protect humanity, but for black Canadians, the church became the foundation for their fight for freedom, dignity, and justice. Enslaved Africans were often introduced to Christianity by their masters. If y'all remember the first episode of season 2 of the podcast, I talked about how enslaved Africans were forcibly converted to Catholicism. Remember Olivier Lejeune? These holy orders had slaves, and they participated in mass, took communion, but they were unable to take up any holy orders, so they couldn't become nuns or priests. This in turn stunted the emergence of a black Catholic church in New France. We have to remember, the Catholic Church held significant sway in New France, as it upheld all the region's laws. The perfect example of this is the story of Mary Joseph Angelique, where she had to beg for forgiveness in vain at the steps of the church. It wasn't until the migration of the black loyalists from the American Revolution that we would see the first black church. Kinda. First, I would like to mention Joseph Leonard. See, Joseph Leonard was a key figure in the black loyalist community of Brindleytown. Leonard, a school teacher and an Anglican lay preacher, provided a unique form of leadership. Leonard was given permission to lead prayer and to read from the Bible. But what he did wasn't that. He went above and beyond. With permission from the colonial bishop, he read from the Bible and led prayers, but he also performed baptisms, marriages, funerals, and communion services, which was well beyond his duties as a lay preacher. Leonard's doings soon caught the ire of the Bishop of Nova Scotia, Charles Inglis. Bishop Charles pulled up to Digby to confront Leonard, and when asked about all he had been doing, Leonard stood on business and asked Bishop Charles to ordain him as an Anglican minister. Bishop Charles refused Leonard, obviously, and replaced him with another black loyalist teacher, Isaiah Limerick. Limerick, however, quickly became unpopular and tensions grew within the community. Leonard's supporters, including local school inspector Colonel Barton, rallied behind him, leading to his reinstatement after Limerick was reassigned. Leonard continued teaching and leading Brindleytown until 1792. Another black loyalist who understood that church isn't about the building, it's about the people worshiping, David George. Born in Virginia as a slave in 1742, witnessed the brutalities of slavery, seeing his family beaten on several occasions, which prompted him to run away to South Carolina. In South Carolina, he hid for several years. He worked for the Creek Native American chief Blue Salt and the Natchez Native Americans Chief Jack, who sold him to a Scottish guide named George Galphin in Silver Bluff, South Carolina. It was here that David George would learn to read through the use of the Bible, get married to a partly Creek woman named Phyllis, have kids, get baptized, and converted to Christianity during the Great Awakening, become a preacher, and help establish the first black Baptist church in Silver Bluff. Wait. Let me run that by you again. The first ever black Baptist church in North America that happens to be in Silver Bluff, South Carolina. Period. This was all between 1773 and 1735. That man did a lot for the age 31. Jesus. Then, 3 years later, in 1778, David George and his congregation fled to British controlled Savannah. While in Savannah, David George preached amongst the black loyalists and supported himself by keeping a small butcher stall. After the Savannahs fell, David George and his wife made it to Charleston, South Carolina, where the British were able to secure over 5,000 black people from 13 colonies. George was able to make it to Nova Scotia in 1782. George and his family settled in Shelburne, Nova Scotia with other black loyalists, and it was there that he became one of the leading black preachers of Shelburne, founding the First Baptist Church in Shelburne. George's powerful preaching attracted both black and white people at large to his camp and his baptisms. At first, the local magistrates forbade him to hold services in town, and so he set up camp in the woods, where his preachings drew people from far and wide. However, when a sympathetic white person gave him a town lot, George began conducting his meetings in Shelburne. By mid-1784, a chapel had been built, and George attracted a congregation of 50 black people and several white people. Okay, so let me give y'all a little bit of context. Since the arrival of refugees from the American Revolutions, resources like jobs and food began to become scarce, which built tensions between the black population and the white population. Okay, do y'all remember season 1, episode 2 from Attack on Titan? When Wall Maria was broken, and then Eren, Mikasa, and Armin, and other refugees had to flee behind Wall Rose. And while behind Wall Rose, the kids were treated poorly, were given meager rations, there was a food shortage, and then the royal government sent out some refugees to quote-unquote cultivate the land within Wall Maria. Yeah, the situation George was in is kind of similar. No, the government didn't send him out to man-eating titans, but he did get roughed up quite a bit. In 1784, a riot erupted. White disbanded soldiers were upset that black people were getting more jobs than them. The race riot also happened when George was attempting to baptize 2 white people. The disbanded soldiers went about attacking black people, tearing down their houses and running them out of town. The soldiers even got into George's church and beat him in the house of the Lord, threatening they would do way worse if he continued preaching. So George took his family and fled to Birchtown. This riot is now known as the Shelburne Race Riot. While in Birchtown, George was required to get a ministry license in order to preach, which limited him to preaching to black people only. But even in Birchtown, George continued to encounter hostility, this time from black Anglicans and Methodists, so he returned to Shelburne. Now this time in Shelburne, George's fame as a preacher grew, and his preaching reached far and wide. He held mass baptisms in St. John, New Brunswick, uniting blacks and whites, but after white complaints, his preaching was restricted to black people. Despite this, George went on to organize black Baptist congregations in Fredericton, St. John, and Nova Scotia, founding 7 churches and training many black preachers. His efforts helped make Baptists the majority among the black population in the region over the next 30 years and laid the foundation for the first black churches and benevolent organizations in North America. George's success was rooted in his ability to connect with the deeply felt needs of the black loyalist, facing discrimination and hardships, including fewer provisions and small land grants. They found George's chapel a place of freedom and equality, offering a stark contrast to their experiences in white-dominated society. His independent approach to church leadership was especially empowering for former slaves, allowing them to take charge of their own faith communities. Although George and other black loyalists were able to make a life in Canada, they still had to put up with the British and their lies of large plots of fertile land. And we know the land that the black loyalists were put on could not support them. And on top of that, racism, discrimination, violence, and mistreatment from the white neighbors. The black loyalists were fed up. And so after petitioning the British government in 1792, 1,196 black Nova Scotians spread across 15 ships, including David George and Joseph Leonard, left Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. It's also worth noting that the white population didn't want the black loyalists to leave. The white population didn't want the black loyalists in their jobs, on their land, nor in their churches. They simply wanted them there for free or cheap labor. A year later, in 1793, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe passed the Upper Canadian Act Against Slavery, which banned the importation of slaves and freed children of enslaved people at the age of 25. This act was the first legislation in the British Empire to limit slavery. Later, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. This in turn led to a massive influx of black people running away from the United States as refugees from the War of 1812 and as fugitive slaves from the Underground Railroad. With this massive influx of the black population came their seeds of religion. Black people came together in the walls of the church. A place that was used to control them now became a place where they banded together to make their communities flourish. But just because the new black population was okay with the influx of black people doesn't mean that the white people were. As black people sought refuge and freedom in Canada, tensions rose within the predominantly white churches. These black settlers, many of whom had experienced the severe oppressions and had only recently escaped physical and psychological abuse, found themselves once again marginalized. Their presence in the pews led to increasing segregation. Black worshipers were often relegated to the galleries, or worse, were advised to worship in their homes altogether. This led to the entrenchment of independent black churches in Canada, where black people could worship freely and assert their dignity. These independent black churches became the hub of all things spiritual, social, and resistance. In these churches, black people were the leaders, teachers, and preachers. There were no reminders that they were second-class citizens. Within the house of the Lord, early black settlers could hone how they could present themselves to the world. Early on, there was the creation of the Baptist churches in Canada. One man in particular was instrumental in fortifying Baptist churches in Canada, Reverend Richard Preston. In 1791, Preston was born to a slave mother and a white father in Virginia. He bought his freedom and made it to Halifax in 1816, where he reunited with his mother, who had escaped earlier as a refugee during the War of 1812. While in Halifax, Preston begins to build off his earlier experience as a plantation preacher and acts as the first black delegate to the Nova Scotia Baptist Association. Then some church drama went down. Basically, a white dude named John Burton held a strong position as the leader of the black community, helping to establish key milestones like getting Preston recognized as a delegate and preacher. However, while Burton focused on his relationship with the Baptist hierarchy, Preston began to focus on the political potential of the black community, using shared experiences of slavery to gain support. As Preston's influence grew, especially in rural areas, Burton's authority weakened. This all came to a head in a dispute at St. Paul's Church. This dispute diminished Burton's power, and Preston's popularity grew as a result. But then another problem came. In order for Preston to do anything, like preside over marriages and funerals and such, he would have to be ordained. So, Prince William Sport and John Hamilton, deacons of the church, collect the money to send Preston to England to become ordained in 1831. In the summer of 1832, he returns with his ordination papers and some money to found a church. But earlier that year, in April 1832, the Cornwallis Street Baptist Church, now New Horizons Baptist Church, was founded. It was there he would serve until 1861. During his life, he went up and down Halifax, Annapolis Valley, and eastern Nova Scotia, founding 11 other churches, which he then formed into the African United Baptist Association in 1854. These churches would often hold conferences where they would get together and tell each other about what was going on in their area, which created strength and community, as well as encouragement for these churches to keep going. Another prominent Baptist minister in Canada is Elder Washington Christian. He was born in Virginia and then escaped to Toronto in 1825. It was in Toronto he began to preach regularly. In 1826, alongside 12 other freedom seekers, he founded the First Baptist Church, Toronto's very first black institution. Elder Christian would go on to preach to both black and white people, drawing a mixed crowd with his powerful preaching style. His church became a beacon of hope and action, hosting lectures on slavery, offering sanctuary to runaway slaves, and creating a Sunday school, a junior temperance society, and even a library for his congregation. As more black people settled in Toronto, Elder Christian's church became a cornerstone of the burgeoning black community, inspiring generations to come. Also, within the same era, another denomination was on the rise, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME for short. The AME Church was first founded in Philadelphia in 1816 by Richard Allen, but it also spread across Canada. The Grand AME Church in Toronto was founded in 1833 and became a beacon for black Canadians, drawing inspirations from the AME Church's emphasis on self-governance and independence. The AME Church was born from the struggles against racism in the US, and its principles of autonomy resonated deeply with black Canadians seeking spaces where they could control their own religious lives. The AME Church also gave rise to a uniquely Canadian church, the British Methodist Episcopal Church, or BME for short. The British Methodist Episcopal Church was formally established on September 29th in 1856. This denomination emerged from the AME Church, with roots in various black congregations across Ontario. The BME Church was formed by both free and formerly enslaved black people seeking spiritual autonomy and community. The separation from the American AME Church was influenced by several factors, including the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and a desire for Canadian AME members to identify more closely with the country that had granted them freedom. The BME Church provided black Canadians with a distinctly Canadian religious identity, one grounded in autonomy, self-governance, and resistance to racial justice. Heading this new denomination was Bishop Willis Nazary. Bishop Willis Nazary was born on March 5, 1808, in the Isle of Wight, Virginia. He later served in the AME Church in the United States, moved to Canada to head the BME Church. Under Nazary's leadership, the BME Church expanded its leadership. He established a conference in Nova Scotia, which led to the division of the church's Canadian territory into two regions, Canada East, Nova Scotia, and Canada West, Ontario. Nazary served as the bishop of the BME Church from its founding in 1856 until his death in 1875. During this nearly two-decade tenure, he guided the church through its formative years. When Bishop Nazary died, Richard Randolph Disney was chosen as his successor. Yes, like the Mickey Mouse Disney. Under Bishop Disney, the BME Church had grown to 56 congregations with about 3,100 members, with significant presence in the Danish West Indies and the British Guiana. He was even able to reunify with the AME Church, but that's a whole nother set of church drama But let's just say you still see AME churches and BME churches in Canada. I'm gonna leave it at that. Speaking more on BME churches, did you know that a notable example of a BME church is Salem Chapel in St. Catharines, Ontario, which was built in 1855 as Bethel Chapel AME Church, replacing an earlier log structure? Did you also know that Harriet Tubman had a house across the street from this church? Did you also know that Harriet Tubman was directly linked to the activities at Salem Chapel? This church became one of the most important stops and hubs in the Canadian section of the Underground Railroad. Many freedom seekers passed through St. Catharines on their journey to freedom, and Salem Church served as a beacon of hope. Tubman, often described as one of the most fearless or feared, depending on who you ask, conductors of the Underground Railroad, is said to have used the church as a base during her missions to guide enslaved people northward. Tubman's connection to Salem Chapel BME Church is significant because it highlights how integral Black churches were to the success of the Underground Railroad. These churches were more than just places of worship, they were critical hubs of activism, shelter, and resistance. They offered a sense of community and a place for like-minded individuals to strategize for liberation, especially for Black people escaping the hellish nightmare that was slavery. The early history of Black churches in Canada is a story of resilience, resistance, and the fight for freedom and equality. Despite facing tremendous opposition, Black religious leaders like David George, Joseph Leonard, and Richard Preston laid the foundation for a strong and enduring community of faith. These churches became more than a place of worship. They were sanctuaries where Black Canadians could redefine their identities, preserve their culture, and organize against systemic oppression. Enslaved Africans transformed Christianity into a tool of emotional survival. Black churches became spaces for collective empowerment, spiritual defiance, and solidarity. Through these sanctuaries, individuals found strength and support in the face of adversity. The church was not just a refuge for spiritual solace, but also a hub for leadership, education, and community building. Black churches in Canada are products of multiple migrations, from Black loyalists, the Jamaican Maroons, refugees from the War of 1812, fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad, and soon to come, Black people from all over the planet, from the West Indian domestic scheme up to the change in the immigration point system. More on that in a later episode. These churches adapted and grew, and continue to adapt and grow, serving as a vital center for social, political, and cultural exchange. For many, the church was both a spiritual and political foundation, empowering them to challenge injustice and forge shared identity. In a society that marginalized and oppressed them, Black churches in Canada became crucial spaces for resistance, leadership, and community. Alright y'all, that's it. Thank you for joining. I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this episode, please drop a like, comment, and follow the podcast for more of your favorite anime-infused Black history. Until next time, peace.